It is not a secret that the advocates of social justice when it comes to comics are very dishonest people. They are leeches that exist to only hijack subcultures and fandom, and honestly, they do a great job of this. But when it comes to the old social justice has always been a part of comics thing, the go-to cliche that they use is referencing the X-Men as an example of this. There are usually two claims that are often misunderstood, very misunderstood, surrounding this idea. One, they say that the X-Men was flat out created to be social justice, and two, the Magneto and Professor X, that whole conflict, they were created to represent MLK and Malcolm X. Both of these are either partially false or entirely false depending on the narrative. Notice, these claims are hardly ever backed up with anything other than like some headline of an article. First and foremost, no, Stan Lee did not create Magneto and Professor X with the sole intent of having them be analogies for MLK and Malcolm X. They weren't even specifically created to represent the civil rights era. If you read the X-Men when it first came out, it's not even remotely analogous to the civil rights era. So it makes sense as to why Stan Lee said in an interview that the metaphor was given to him more so as a gift. It like fell in his lap. He didn't specifically create it, and he didn't create the comic to represent the civil rights era. It was more of a case that there happened to be a metaphor at the time that could really make the narrative more relatable. He even admits that any sort of portrayal in terms of Magneto being Malcolm and Professor X being like MLK was something that was done unconsciously. He literally says that himself. He didn't try to do it. This makes sense again because Magneto in his first appearances was just a regular cutthroat sort of villain. Professor X and the X-Men sort of stood in his way. He was a supremacist in a sense. He had intentions on ruling the world and the lesser humans, not any sort of common goal with Professor X. Don't take my word for anything, just go read the comics starting in 1963 up until really the damn 80s. To say that they were specifically created to be metaphors for the civil rights era is not only lazy, it's flat out and verifiably false. It wasn't until the 80s when Magneto became more of a villain that people sort of tried to sympathize with, and he had that past intertwined with Professor X. That was actually a bit of a retcon. So if the SJWs read comics, which they don't, they'd understand this. Chris Claremont's era of X-Men is way more analogous to that era, but even that isn't specifically referenced to the Civil Rights era. Again, that's something that he clearly admits in interviews. He said that the metaphors he thought about were along the lines of Begin and the Israeli dichotomy, not the civil rights dichotomy. Again, something else he admitted in interviews. So factually speaking, not opinion, the X-Men were not created to represent the civil rights era by way of Stan Lee, and even the retcon of X and Magneto during Claremont's run, they weren't created as such. Now that this is out the way, it is no secret that the X-Men have had stories created around them that can absolutely be interpreted in multiple ways. That's what good writers are able to do. It's also not a secret that mutants have been disenfranchised at times. X-Men have been the enemy of not only the standard villains, but governments and the citizens among them, though not always. This conflict has made for some very classic storylines and became the identity of the X-Men. The problem is that the social justice advocates conflate this with social justice. This is why I think that they are projecting when they say things like, everyone you dislike is a social justice warrior according to you. No. I think that everything that you do like is something that you like to claim is related to social justice. Anybody with half a brain, however, understands that heroes being disenfranchised or aliens or types of people being enfranchised and made to be the enemies of others because they are different is not exclusive to social justice. In fact, I'd argue that just about every single mainstream comic book character has had some sort of conflict where they have people or types of people that are disliking them because of what they are. This isn't even exclusive to the X-Men or mutants. This is also a self-defeating point because Malcolm X was not an advocate of what you guys consider to be social justice. Ironically enough, he's one of the most misunderstood civil rights figures, as people just think that he was simply a more militant MLK. He wasn't as peaceful. He was willing to fight back. This is objectively false. I have a video going through some of Malcolm's ideals, and I'll link that in the description. But brother Malcolm X and the MLK were ideologically, fundamentally opposed. They weren't friends. They weren't even former friends like X and Magneto were after the retcons. And the social justice advocates that advocate diversity and inclusion, he wasn't for diversity and inclusion. He damn sure wasn't an integrationist like MLK was. The only similarity they shared is that they both recognized that black people were getting the crap end of the stick. Malcolm X, however, wasn't trying to do sit-ins or force himself into white businesses or championing the Civil Rights Act or anything like that. Nor was he trying to force white people to accept him. He, in fact, wanted blacks to be self-sufficient, and he knew that the Civil Rights Act was sort of a joke and the politicians were just using black people to sort of advance their power. But he wasn't a supremacist either, like folks on the other side tried to paint him as, especially post-Mecca. This wasn't a case of two people with the same end game and different tactics. This was two individuals on completely opposite ends in terms of end game. So all in all, this is nothing but revisionist history by way of the social justice advocates who simply want to excuse the comic book hijack and bad writing. X-Men doesn't even prove your point, as they aren't on the nose like many writers are now. They had stories that were up for different interpretations in terms of social reference and relevance. This is unlike Captain Marvel writers telling you straight up in the dialogue that they aren't losing reporters to 7-foot misogynists. That's actually in the dialogue. This is why you're trying to excuse your nonsense by referencing the X-Men as a self-detonating point, because those comics aren't written like the nonsense that we see today. So you're wrong on multiple fronts. Those X-Men comics could be metaphors for a multitude of different things. Being disenfranchised is not exclusive to social justice. Neither is fighting against bigotry or having people dislike you because of who you are. It's not a difficult thing to do. You can relate to disenfranchised people or people being treated unfairly while also recognizing that social justice is stupid. And I'm not even saying that Stan Lee hated social justice or was an anti-social justice advocate. I'm not even saying that the X-Men was anti-social justice. I'm not even saying that you couldn't find similarities between movements or minority groups and X-Men in terms of their experience. Absolutely, you can find those similarities with conflicts such as racism. I'm saying that to refer to that and say that it was created to be representative of the civil rights era is simply not true. And to try to pin the fact that mutants are minorities as proof that it's social justice is both intellectually lazy and dishonest. You, as a cornball social justice advocate, do not get to claim monopoly on having to deal with or being against things such as folks that are being disenfranchised or not being liked because of who they are. This is something that many individuals of different political and socio-political backgrounds can recognize or experience or relate to, including folks like myself, which sees social justice as the gimmick that it is in concept, because there is no such thing as social justice. There's only justice. These SJWs just want credit for something and excuses for continuing to ruin characters in books that they don't even read. Y'all aren't even inclusive. All that kumbaya, love everybody, has an asterisk next to it that says we only love you if you agree with us. As soon as folks like my black ass says something that is against the narrative, trust me, y'all are quick to sling out those racist connotations because, well, I don't behave like SJWs think black people should behave. You motherfuckers ain't special and you're raging hypocrites. And while that may be a little bit of my opinion, what isn't my opinion is that some of you are just flat out lying about the history of the X-Men. Before this video ends, I want to also add that I think that it's very important that you oppose the SJWs who try to go out of their way to make it seem as if being an advocate of social justice is exclusive to being against racism or bigotry and things like that. It is that line of thinking that allows them to try to say that somebody's racist or somebody is sexist simply because they disagree with social justice, or worse, because they simply disagree with an SJW.